Thanks for tuning in to the Replatform podcast sponsored by Amplience and Clavio. You're listening to the e-commerce ruminations of me, James Gerd, and my co-host, Paul Rogers. How you doing, buddy?
Yeah, good, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm all good, mate. I'm enjoying the snow, actually. I've had a nice snow fight with my kids today in the back garden, which is amazing. Working hard.
Yeah, it's been nice to be fair. I've worked from home today as well, which is always a good treat.
Excellent. And we got another interesting guest, so I'm going to set up the intros. And then we'll let him explain a bit more about what he does. But first, thank you for tuning back into our regular listeners. And if it's your first time on the podcast, we hope you enjoy it. If you subscribe, we send out episode alerts every week, and we'd love a rating on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple. Thank you very much. So our topic today is understanding the true value proposition for headless commerce, and the guest is Studio Rotate. So look, it's buzzword bingo, headless, composable. They're thrown around a lot in the industry, but amidst the noise, there are some interesting projects emerging demonstrating the value that flexible technology approaches can have to businesses if businesses properly understand the impact to go down this route and have the right partners to guide them through the challenges of making the right architectural decision. So today we've got an expert on who's got stacks of real-world project experience. We're going to cover the real value proposition for investment in headless. How does the challenge and experience of building on different headless platforms compare? What does good front-end tooling look like? And when headless isn't the right approach, which is equally as important. So welcome to the podcast, Jim Tattersall, who's the founder and CTO at Rotate. How are you, Jim?
I'm very well, thank you. Also enjoyed the snow today. Got to throw lots of snowballs in my daughter's faces, so that's always a win. And definitely a perk of working from home. But yes, thank you so much for having me on. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to being grilled.
Excellent. So you've got an interesting background as head of digital music industry for like Gut and Roadrunner Records. And I was noticing that Roadrunner Records artists include things, bands like Slipknot, Slash and Korn. So you really specialise in like light classical music, right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, no, a bit of a heavy metal fan and loved working there for many years and looking after digital there. And actually, when I set my first agency, we pretty much exclusively worked with for artists at the beginning then. So yeah, loved it. Good fun.
Fantastic. And now, so Rotate positions itself as a strategic design and tech partners for e-com brands. But you've clearly got a focus around the headless piece. Do you want to just summarize to people, like what is it you do? What are the key services you provide to people?
Yeah, so we try and be a bit of a holistic offering for e-commerce and kind of like strategic partners. So we very much believe in kind of composable commerce and the approaches on that, but mainly for the business value that kind of brings to the table. In terms of our offering, strategy, kind of test, kind of, data-driven, kind of data-informed kind of like development. So lots of research and development kind of like goes into stuff, lots of user testing. Everything we build and deployed is split tested, for both risk management and also, validation of like stuff that we're doing is actually kind of works. I think that's really important in the e-commerce space. So yeah, we kind of try and be your, e-commerce partner and to the point where we can help you build up your own team and kind of move away. But proud to say that we're very much partners with people we work with and have been working with brands for, some of them, actually one of them for like 9 years, but many of them for like over 5-6 years. So,
Great. Well, I'll ask the first question. So Rotate are pretty well known for being, really early to the headless movement. As you were saying earlier, you were doing it before some of the platforms even really started allowing for it. Can you just talk us through what led you to go down this road initially?
Yeah. So, for us, it always comes down to strong believer that actually, the tech solution is kind of should be driven by like the business goals. And I think, with headless and like, that kind of composable kind of outlook, that was definitely kind of what kind of pushed us to there. Previous agency, we'd worked a lot with, because the advent of like mobile, this is how old I am, the advent of like mobile kind of browsing stuff and apps and stuff that actually API kind of pushed experiences kind of made sense, right? You had multiple experiences, different places, API backed. So when when I kind of set up Rotate, that was always in the kind of back of my mind anyway. But then we just came across, many kind of challenges working with SaaS platforms. Big believer in SaaS platforms, the idea of reducing the surface area of what we have to do, so we're focusing on the stuff that, adds the most value, and where we can make the biggest difference. but there were just too many restrictions. And in the early days, it was mainly around like the UX and the experience that we were trying to create for users. Before we started, we were talking about like Tracksmith as an example. They're a very kind of content kind of rich, brand, amazing, brand from Boston. Check them out, Tracksmith. And back then they were massively frustrated. They wanted to go to Shopify. They tried it with a few agencies, but they couldn't kind of curate the content they wanted to. And we ended up kind of building a kind of composable system, I guess, an early kind of like version of that many moons ago, where, we kind of created separate CMS. They could preview, drag and drop, all this kind of stuff. This was before, I said, storefront API or page builder in kind of in Shopify. And it was just kind of pushing the content in. So it very much came from initially the need to kind of create a richer kind of more, greater storytelling, for those kind of clients.
Great. And I think there's always there is always a lot of discussion around where Headless fits and doesn't fit. What's your view on the kind of main value prop for Headless for a mid-market brand, and how do you think this has changed over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so I mean, I think initially that kind of drive, as I mentioned before, was around kind of like storytelling, the UX, that kind of just kind of the curation of that kind of experience. I think as time's gone on, and we've been doing it for a long time now, the benefits that we kind of see around composability in your kind of architecture, aside from just Headless and on its own, are pretty massive. So I think one really interesting stat is we've been working with clients for, said 6, 7, 8 years. For all of them, we've only done one rebuild, and that's the initial rebuild we did. We've never done a rebuild for any of them since. And you look at someone like Chili's, who we've been working for, 6 years-ish, and there's so many iterations, right? Every single part of the system has been changed, but there's no kind of big sweeping, cool, let's rip it all up and start again. And I think that was always like a desire for us, right? The idea that you kind of go, well, why, if you were like a larger company, just because you're an SME, why should you kind of compromise on that stuff? If you're a bigger company with a large tech team, you wouldn't just rip it up and start again. You'd iterate, and you'd iterate on those learnings as well. So the things that kind of like drive people now are, longevity, right? One rebuild, the idea that you kind of iterate, and although you might have an initial larger like cost, over the kind of like longer period, it kind of definitely kind of makes sense. Best in class tooling. So you have people who are like, on Shopify or, whatever, Ecommerce or whatever platform they're on. And they'll be like, okay, so actually this isn't good enough, right? The DAM solution, or the CMS solution or whatever isn't what we need. We need content scheduling or whatever. So looking at best in class tooling, I think that's a big one. Another one is like building for the unknown. So in a composable system where you don't know where who would have predicted the last few years, and the kind of things that's kind of thrown at us, and businesses having to kind of move quite quickly. So the agility that kind of composable architecture allows you to have. I mentioned Chili's, within the space of under 8 weeks, we completely moved e-commerce platform. Now, that was one developer as well, in 8 weeks, completely moving. And after that, they then rolled out in 30 territories as part of that. So that's another thing. Like, you wouldn't have been able to do that move if you really had, the next kind of point, I guess, is vendor lock-in. If you've got hard vendor lock-in, it's very hard to kind of go, okay, we're just going to change this one part because everything is so coupled together. So yeah, building for the unknown, reduced vendor lock-in is definitely one. And yeah, maintaining those learnings as you kind of like iterate. As we're seeing more now, as you control that, a big thing for us over the last few years has been things like split testing on the edge, which is quite hard, especially if you're using a SaaS platform, which again, it's like something that we think is, pretty important to kind of, make sure you're focusing on the right things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that I think that's going to be an interesting area. People doing more stuff on the edge over the next few years. I have a sub question, and this is a slightly rogue one because it wasn't on the list that we gave you earlier. But you talked about Chili's and you talked about them moving platform. So I guess Chili's is, a lot of people have referenced that site over the last few years. It's a bit ahead of its time, I would say, in terms of the like engaging kind of nature of the theme, and it's also a really modern design generally. What made them / you move to commerce layer?
Yeah, so this is a great example, I guess. So thanks for answering the question. It's a great kind of like discussion point, right? Because we'd already gone headless with them. So, and I think this talks to the evolution of like composability, right? That you kind of break it up and you make it more, more of a composition, more kind of like fragmented kind of parts as you kind of have those needs and those business kind of, requirements. So they were already headless on Shopify at the point we went to commerce layer. And a few kind of things kind of like prompted us to kind of make the move. So one of them was actually after around like 7 million in turnover, the cost for Shopify gets pretty prohibitive, well, not prohibitive, but it gets quite punchy. So there was a cost analysis of kind of going, well, if we look at like the market, if we, speak to Adyen or Braintree or, or Stripe directly, what can we do in terms of rates and what does that kind of look like? It turned out actually in their instance with Braintree and PayPal, because a lot went through PayPal as well, that actually the savings of moving off of Shopify were pretty significant, like hundreds of thousands significant. So that was one consideration. Another one was actually that as we'd evolved to being a headless, completely headless store, actually the Shopify's kind of core APIs were pretty slow. They've actually gotten much better in the last few years, like in terms of, in terms of speed, like response times, in terms of their APIs. But back then, 3-4 years ago, they were pretty abysmal, in terms of API response times. And also actually the uptime wasn't great as well. Their reported uptime versus actual uptime, from our monitoring tools, a little bit different. Again, I think their infrastructure has gotten much better in the last few years. So there are a few drivers. One was actually like improved speed. One was actually completely custom checkout. And as I said, and then the cost saving exercise. So I think we didn't think, which was a bit of a surprise, that actually, given that Shopify completely, a big selling point of Shopify is that they they constantly iterate on their checkout, that we thought, oh, this is going to be pretty hard to kind of compete with. But actually, a surprising factor was that when we kind of moved over, that our checkout rate kind of abandonment like massively dropped, and we had a big win. When actually we thought the migration would be pretty much the same, slightly faster. We didn't change any of the UI, UX, or anything like that. We thought it would be pretty comparable in terms of performance, and then the wins would come later on when we'd be able to faster roll out internationally. Because again, that's another part of the piece, right? Back then, 30 plus territories, which is what we pushed out 6 months after, within 6 months of moving over to commerce layer. That was pretty tricky on Shopify back then. So these were the sorts of motivators that came along. I said the savings from the payment gateway kind of more than paid for the development. And as I said, despite that, we still had massive uplift in terms of, conversion rates and other kind of key metrics around the site. So, yeah.
I got a question around because we talked about the value proposition for Headless, but before we start recording, we were also talking about the fact that you're not going to be building for everyone, because there are some times when the use case isn't right. So like, Headless isn't in itself a need; it's a solution. But sometimes it feels like certain areas of the industry push Headless as the ultimate solution to all e-commerce ailments, which we know it's not. And it's not always needed, and it does add some complexity and maintenance in other areas, and sometimes more than people expect. And they don't realise. I think some businesses go into it not realising what they're biting off and what the implications are. So I'd love to hear from all the experience from the projects that you've done and the ones where you decide not to. What are the scenarios in which you think a business should avoid going down a headless route?
I would say, if you're kind of turning over less than 1 to 2 million, I'd say I'd kind of look at whether it kind of makes sense to go, to go fully headless. I also, to your point, like headless is, should be a solution to business problems, right? And not just the destination itself. I don't think headless should be a destination. I think, what you're trying to solve should be the destination. And headless is just like a way of kind of helping, you kind of get there. Like saying there's a lot of noise at the moment. And actually, when you think about things I talked about earlier, lack of, reduced vendor lock-in and stuff like that, when you look at some of the rhetoric and kind of like talk around headless at the moment, even like with Shopify's kind of solution, you're still getting vendor lock-in there, right? And so it's kind of like, well, what's the advantage that this is kind of giving? Like for me, the advantage is around creating a composable system that is kind of empathetic to the business needs. Now, Shopify and other, I keep mentioning Shopify, but any kind of like e-commerce solution generally will try and cover, the majority of like use cases within a certain, within what is kind of sensible, right? And if you fit into a lot of those things, and there's no real kind of like business solution that you're solving by going headless, it probably isn't worth it. Like you're saying, there are additional development costs. Third-party integrations are generally kind of like have kind of, more problematic. And obviously, if you've got something like Shopify and the kind of rich ecosystem around it, there are many advantages to that. So it's very much kind of assessing the business needs, the maturity of the business, and whether the investments, they're going to see the return basically on the investment, which is only going to happen at a certain size anyway, in terms of the micro optimizations that you can kind of make when you are fully composed.
Yeah, I think it's good you pulled out the thing about the third party piece, because one of the great advantages of the leading SaaS platforms like BigCommerce, Shopify, etc., is that app ecosystem and that speed. So you get that agility. But yeah, you're right that some of those aren't necessarily designed to work smoothly in a bespoke front end framework, and having to think about the integration cost of setting those up. In addition, I think people underestimate that and think that if you go headless on these platforms, that everything is just going to work as it does.
Yeah, I mean, another great one actually is like the things that are often overlooked, things like Shopify Analytics. So, you've got Shopify Analytics, which is, really rich, great, actually, analytics suite. And it kind of is the case that, you go headless. I mean, it's changed recently, but up until about 6 months ago, you couldn't get any of that headless data really kind of into, you couldn't get it into Shopify Analytics. Now, it's not kind of actively kind of advertised, but if you look, in the Hydrogen kind of like code base, there is kind of like obviously events that are being fired, and that's kind of getting built up so that full suite of like, analytics view within, Shopify will be kind of there. But even now, it's not, it's not fully there. So yeah, there's definitely caveats and trade-offs. I would say business as a company has to be a certain level of maturity, and there has to be that kind of like level of, I mean, we talk about optimizations actually. If like business we work with, the third-party integration, when you do, one-click install through Shopify, quite often that's not very well optimized for, in terms of front-end performance. And when you kind of are hand coding it, obviously there are optimizations, but those optimizations might be completely lost if the business is only doing a certain turnover, or do you know what I mean? They're just certain, it just hasn't got the same value that it might have on a business of of a larger size.
And for people who don't know the platforms as well technically, like you've built sites on a number of platforms, and there's probably different reasons why me and Paul know as well, when you recommend a platform over another, there are reasons why you get to that decision, and there's always compromises because no platform's perfect. But how have you found building like headless solutions on top of Shopify versus like a true API first solution like Commerce or Commerce Tools? Are they fundamentally different from a development challenge and complexity point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's actually far easier to build a headless build on one of those modern, but API first kind of platforms, whether it's, Swell, Centra, Commerce Layer, Commerce Tools. It's far easier because the API is just put together far better. It's way more considered because they know their audience, right? I mean, in terms of the experience, I think generally for most clients that we work with, starting on Shopify is kind of great. Then you go headless Shopify, and eventually you reach the point where Shopify is probably, not the right kind of solution, But yeah, in terms of working from it, they've got different audiences, right? So Commerce Layer, Commerce Tools, the technical support is incredible. Like you're speaking to engineers, you're not going to get that with Shopify because they're dealing with different audience, and different kind of they just got a different audience, right? I'd also say, as I kind of mentioned earlier, at a certain scale, it does kind of get more affordable, some of those API first kind of platforms. And the main thing for us is that when you kind of work with like an API first solution like Commerce Layer or Commerce Tools, aren't any real limitations. There's nothing you can't code around, right? So, I want completely bespoke kind of tax rules, or, completely bespoke kind of discount mechanics, whatever. some of this stuff, you can, kind of starts to come into Shopify, but within the kind of like remit of commerce tools or commerce layer, there's really nothing you can kind of, you can't do. So yeah, I'd say they're the kind of some of the high level differences.
So obviously we've just been talking about commerce tools, and commerce tools is everywhere at the minute. Obviously they are doing a lot of marketing, and yeah, they've won some really high profile deals. You've worked with commerce tools and you've worked with a number of others. What's it like working with commerce tools? You mentioned Centra a couple of minutes ago, and I think that's probably a good example of maybe an API first platform that's maybe got slightly more kind of functionality within it. Whereas the feedback I've had on commerce tools is it's like truly best in class, but it is, a core, or like, yeah, you are really buying into like a set of best in class APIs. Like, what's your experience with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that scale of API first platforms, you've got kind of someone like Swell at one end, then you've got Centra and Commerce Layer kind of in the middle, and then you've got Commerce Tools at the other end, right? Swell tries to give you as close to a Shopify-esque kind of experience where they kind of give you a lot out of the box. For me, Centra and Commerce Layer have a really nice balance where they kind of go, you don't really want to do payment gateway integrations, like this is a solved problem. And if you want to, you can kind of not use them and write your own, obviously, but they offer kind of like a better level of kind of convenience. And then at the other end is Commerce Tools, where it's very kind of bare bones. Now, interestingly, like is it Ben at kind of at Rafa was kind of like asking a similar sort of thing a few months ago, right, when he was kind of doing a vendor assessment. And I think it comes down to, where do you want to spend your engineering time, and what's kind of, and what's going to be a kind of restriction around this kind of stuff. They're all great platforms. We're partners with all of them, so I'm going to be careful. But I would say I would find it hard to recommend commerce tools unless you had quite a mature internal dev team. The amount of engineering and the amount of overhead that you have to kind of look after is immensely powerful. It's incredibly robust and like scalable. Like that stuff is second to none. But the amount of engineering and additional architecture you have to look after around that kind of stuff isn't small. Also, even things like their kind of merchant center, which Commerce Layer, for instance, have their order management system. Like if you look at Centra or you look at Commerce Layer, their kind of admin areas are pretty polished and quite very user friendly. For commerce tools, that's less of a thing because, and if you look at the merchant center, it does feel quite rough and ready, in places. But that's because the expectation is actually that a lot of these, brands are going to build their own kind of experience, or, just literally it's just going to go directly with like their PIMs and the ERPs or whatever, like to kind of build up this architecture. And actually, commerce tools doesn't really have a face. It just, literally just as API endpoints to kind of tie this stuff together. So for me, I would say most brands, if they're kind of doing under, like 100 million, like for me, that kind of middle space is the right kind of balance of like not over architecting stuff, and beyond that, if you're kind of like very kind of like, if you're a much larger company than that, then I think that's when I start to look at kind of commerce tools, and if that was the kind of, appropriate kind of solution. But also in terms of their methodologies and their approach, like Commerce Layer and Commerce Tools, especially, very, very different. Commerce Tools kind of actually have some awareness of like merchandising. They're thinking about what does the product look like and all this kind of stuff. Whereas Commerce Layer is, Filippo would describe it as a, kind of transactional, commerce, where they're literally just looking at individual SKUs, which as a model is super interesting because what we've seen is that over the last kind of like 9 years of Rotate, that it's amazing because we're not rebuilding anything, how often companies want to change how they merchandise stuff, right? Oh, by colorway, or now, no, we don't want to do this. And actually we're changing, we don't want to have it gender specific and all this kind of stuff. And when you've kind of got very hard tie kind of product modeling, it can be quite disruptive versus kind of going, no, there isn't, right? Like this is the commerce platform. This is not where we're doing kind of merchandising and thinking like that. This is literally where we're kind of recording price, weights, inventory levels and things like this, and handling those kind of transactions rather than the merchandising and how we're going to bundle this stuff together. So I would say Commerce Layer makes it quite hard to make by hand architectural decisions because it kind of breaks it down like that, which is really interesting. It actually is a bit of a differential between Commerce Layer and saying everything else that's kind of like on the market. But yeah, for me, those kind of ones that bang in the middle, like Commerce Layer and Centra, really good for like that kind of balance of convenience, speed to market, and without kind of having that additional, engineering overhead. Also, you can kind of do anything if you want to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I've worked with Centra looked at Centra more than I have Commerce Layer, but yeah, both of those seem impressive. So next question, again, this is another rogue one that wasn't on the original list, but it feels like you'll be able to answer it. You mentioned hydrogen earlier. You'd been, playing around with hydrogen. I'm not sure how much you've kind of done with Shopify more recently, but what's your view on hydrogen? Like, there are rumors that they're obviously rebuilding it at the moment, but in terms of like Shopify introducing that side of things and kind of enabling Headless a bit more within their kind of own environment, like, what's your view on, where that might go?
I've got quite strong opinions on this. So for me, the whole point, well, one of the points of like having a composable architecture is that you don't want vendor lock-in. You want the freedom, like we had with Chili's, and we just want, we wanted to move e-commerce platform. We didn't want to be tied into an ecosystem because that reduces the agility that we need to be able to move with a business, and the needs change, right? Like over time, they change, especially if you're going to be with with a partner for years and years and years. So I do worry about hydrogen and oxygen. Like hydrogen, they've made some technical decisions, right? Things like Next, kind of powering that. And all of a sudden you kind of go, well, all of a sudden Headless is Sanity, Next.js, Shopify. You're not really in control. Like that, for me, gets away from the whole point of things being kind of composable and you kind of choosing the right kind of tools for the job. I think also, interestingly, there's definitely a movement away from like SPAs, like single page applications and things like Next. They do have a massive overhead. Like historically, we've done, predominantly like SPAs. But when we talk about Headless, we're actually talking about SPAs, like some of the headaches that we talk about, like third-party integrations and stuff like that. Why is that so long? It's because we're building these, massive monolithic JavaScript apps. And over the last kind of 6 months, there's been a real kind of a pushback around the amount of JavaScript we're kind of shipping, on the front end. And when Shopify kind of does a move like this, where they're saying, this is how this is how we think you should kind of do headless kind of e-commerce, it just doesn't sit well. Also, looking through the code base, there's some pretty ropey code in there. But yeah, I think the sentiment is good, the move is good, and it's only positive for like Headless in general. But I think I would give it a little bit of time to kind of mature before we definitely kind of like look at that stuff. But as I said, main things like vendor lock-in really doesn't sit well with me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the hope is, it just comes along over time. But yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. So going back to the questions that you were aware of, on the front end side, so I know from looking at your sites, you've worked with a few different kind of headless CMSs, and you've changed a few areas around kind of delivery and stuff. Do you currently have a preferred set of tooling on the front end side of things?
So our that kind of tooling on the front end is kind of evolving for us quite a lot, kind of related to the last question. So I think, what's been headless, at least for the last few years, has kind of tended to be like an SPA, right? Powered by, React and Next, or Vue and Nuxt. And I think this kind of has led to a bit of a problem, which is these kind of we talk about monolithic backends, where it's like, oh, you've got big vendor lock into a backend, but it's the same on the front end. You kind of go, well, we built this monolithic front end and we're hard tied to React, or we're hard tied to Next.js. And that's also not good in terms of like, agility and kind of being quick to kind of like change. And over time, we've seen that those, because they're, these massive JavaScript apps, over time, once you're maintaining those for a number of years, they build up technical debt really quickly, far faster than like a traditional kind of like multi-page kind of like app does. So what we're doing at the moment, what we've been doing over the last kind of few months, is moving to like micro front ends or island architecture, and having a migration path for all of our clients where we basically turn all those SPAs into multi-page apps, and we decouple ourselves from any single framework, right? Because we don't want to get to the point where, we had it with Nuxt. Nuxt 2, and this is maybe getting a bit too niche, but when the latest version of Vue came out like a couple of years ago, and we wait for Nuxt to upgrade, it took like 2 years to finish that upgrade to the framework, and it only kind of got released like a month ago. And you realize how dangerous it is to kind of be tied to anything really like too specific. So the idea with building something like a micro front end or island architecture is you kind of go, look, we can have these different islands of interactivity, and it's not tied to any single one. And so that's kind of where we're moving. We've seen it with quite a lot of brands where they've invested very heavily on, I said like Next.js, and there is a danger that it means it's much harder to move. And we're consulting at the moment with some, very large brands, 50 plus kind of like engineers who are kind of hitting these issues, these kind of velocity issues with these kind of like monolithic, SPA front end. So sorry, back to your question, Paul. So in terms of that front end stack, we're moving towards micro front ends. The other thing is we're looking at GTM and actually that kind of integration piece, because we're seeing with services like Zaraz, which like Cloudflare is kind of offering, which basically does like server side kind of tracking and stuff rather than keeping it on the client side. Getting, better kind of reporting in terms of tracking, but also reducing the weight on the front end. GTM has a lot to kind of answer for in my mind in terms of like weighing down the front end experience and like the performance around that stuff. So in short, moving away from GTM, looking at services like Zaraz, which are great, and also moving from like sparse and monolithic front ends to micro front ends and island architecture.
I've got a question around the business operational impact of changing your architectural approach from going from like a standardized platform where you're using their themes and it's just doing it all for you, or a monolithic, one of the big older systems, and going to a more modern headless setup where you have your commerce application, you might have CMS as the front end, or you've got a custom front end, because it is a change in the ways of working. And you've touched on some of the technical considerations. I'd love to hear from your point of view. What do you think merchants, e-commerce teams need to understand in how it will impact them on an ongoing basis once they move to a new way of working?
Yeah, I mean, I think it should always be like a phased approach. I think it's really quite problematic when people kind of move from a monolithic architecture, which is or system which is doing loads of stuff for them, and a lot of this stuff is they almost take for granted because it's this is what an e-commerce system does. Whether it's like your transactional emails or like search or merchandising and page builders and analytics and all this kind of stuff, and all those kind of integrations. Whether it's your ERP or whatever. And I think quite often, especially now because headless composable commerce is in vogue, that they're kind of almost jumping on that bandwagon purely for the hype, right? Of it's like, it's the thing to do, right? But so I think the main thing is to kind of, whoever you're working with, to actually kind of do a full assessment of what you're kind of using, and what that is going to look like in this new, headless, or composable world. And also that should be like a staggered, should be a staggered thing, right? So as I said, if a client comes to us and they're in Shopify, it's unlikely that I'm going to be like, well, let's just move your e-commerce platform as well. It's like, well, no, let's not do that. Let's take, let's have a kind of phased and kind of like staged approach. I think when we talk about things like analytics is a big part of that, and you might have to move that to like a different analytics suite or BI kind of tool to kind of like get full visibility on that. Another one which you mentioned is like the plugin infrastructure and kind of the velocity around some of that stuff. It is slower in some instances, but the code quality is better, the performance is better. But the idea of that kind of, click and go just won't exist in the same way that it has before when you're in this kind of completely tied up and neat kind of ecosystem. Hopefully, if you're working with a good partner, the idea that it's composable is that the first thing that they're kind of, the agency, is trying to work out is what is the right solution for you. We've had it with, merchants where they work with like Brightpearl, for instance, and they're using an off-the-shelf kind of plugin. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, we're going to build our own custom integration. It's not particularly expensive, but also they had so many issues with that plugin, what it was doing previously, but they thought that was it. They thought that was the only solution, right? This client, in fact, was on Magento previously, and they had a Magento Brightpearl kind of integration. And they're saying it's like the bane of their life because the agency was playing the plugin and ultimately when you go to this composable architecture, the agency or your in-house team, it's all on them, right? Because they're looking after all this infrastructure rather than, you could have something on Shopify with 20 plugins. Who's looking after each one of those 20 plugins, right? So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, James. Probably not very well. But yeah, I think in terms of operational impacts, hopefully, the idea is that it should be sympathetic and empathetic to how you work, rather than being something that is, disruptive and is, disjointed to kind of what you're doing. It should be working for you. That's the whole point of it. If it's not doing that, it needs to be questioned why that kind of decision is kind of being made.
Yeah, it does answer. I guess there's no easy answer because until you know what your full tech stack is around a headless setup, it's hard to articulate exactly what's changing on a day-to-day basis. But I think what I find when I've had a few clients say, "Oh, we want to go headless," comes back to our point earlier, which is headless isn't a goal. You get to that after you understand the business need and work out whether architecture that's the right solution to give the business in the cost-effective way. But I find a lot of the time it is really just trying to sit them down and say, okay, so you're used to doing everything in one way. You're wanting to open this up and you're wanting to have a completely different way of working from like a content production and delivery and publishing point of view. Therefore, you've got to have a process. I think often people underestimate their need to refine and review process internally to work effectively with new tooling. So I think that it's trying to get half the battle is getting people to realize that the tooling itself doesn't solve everything. You sometimes actually have to fix a few processes internally as well.
Yeah, I think also that it should always be an iterative process, right? I think any kind of big bang is never a good thing, right? Whenever we're moving a large client, to a kind of headless environment, we'll try and keep almost everything we can the same, because once we're headless, then we can kind of split test everything we're doing and kind of just make sure that every change that we're making is kind of making a meaningful kind of difference to them. But you just to mitigate risk more than anything, right? Like the idea again when we talk about changing your site every 3 years, whatever. Oh my god, the risk is absolutely would petrify me if my client said that. Right, here we go. We're just going to switch it this day. What's for a completely different experience? That's absolutely bizarre, especially when you're talking about an e-commerce website. But yeah.
Right. That Brightpearl point you mentioned earlier as well. I've had that with every client that uses Brightpearl, where they're using one the native Shopify connector or their own Shopify connector, or just a random plugin, and they've written off Brightpearl, and then they've gone on to rebuild the integration or a different connector, and it's solved half their problems. But yeah, it's funny that one, how often that comes up. So next question. So we talked about the kind of operational impacts of headless for an ecom team. Given the fact that you're headless only, or as far as I know, headless only, have you kind of done anything internally to reduce the overhead around ongoing development for these kind of headless stacks? So I think one of the other arguments against headless is often the additional cost for kind of ongoing new feature development. So say, I don't know, like a notify me when back in stock, maybe that might, cost more money as a result of needing to do development on both sides and testing on both sides, etc. So is that something that you've kind of been able to address on your side?
Yeah, again, come back to the whole goal, and that's solving business problems, right? And if it's prohibitively expensive or, is unjustifiably expensive, for me, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense, right? Part of our moving from, that move from SPAs, single page apps to kind of multi-page apps, is actually to kind of improve, we looked at the value that was actually delivering, in terms of actual conversions. And that wasn't what the win was in terms of headless, right? Or composable architecture. And so we kind of go, well, an MPA is more robust, quicker to kind of iterate on, quicker, integrations for third parties. So one of the things we're doing is, as I said, migrating our clients from SPAs to MPAs and looking at that to kind of bring down cost. Other thing we're doing is actually we've built up a kind of a services team who are purely working on reusable kind of components. So we can kind of use those across multiple clients. And again, with the micro front end, the idea is that you can actually have, here are 5 clients, all with the same version of, search. That search might just be the logic, and the presentation of it can be separated or it can be included. So yeah, we're trying, and we're doing a number of things to kind of like bring those costs down. I mean, we're at the point now where we're looking at, for a new build, sub 150K, which is pretty, right, we're pretty happy with that kind of getting to that kind of point, because I think in terms of, that's where it kind of comes to the point where it's not enormously different from for a new build for, like a more kind of traditional kind of site. And in terms of, I said, like keeping those ongoing costs down, I said, we've looked at our architecture and made changes to kind of reduce the cost for like additional features. Plus, as I said, standardizing kind of core kind of like components that can be used across clients, but still have a unique look and feel.
Interesting. And I've got a final question, just a bit of devil's advocate in for helping people to approach decision making a bit smarter, because you've gone through this on so many different projects. And I think sometimes businesses can be given a bit of a bum steer on the full implication of a systems architecture change on terms of things like cost and ways of working. Have you got what advice? I know you'll have not have you got, but what is your best advice if a business is thinking of going down this route? What should they focus on? What are the best questions they should be asking to help them really understand what impact it's going to have on their business if they suddenly go into a full headless architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on a few of these things, right? Like, and I think James, like, we kind of mentioned that ultimately it's not, headless should never be the destination. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It might be, so I say that's where you start, right? You kind of start and kind of go, well, what are we actually trying to achieve? What's our North Star? What's our goals? And not from a technical standpoint, in terms of as a business, right? If that means we want more agility or want faster, time to market features, that's when you kind of go, okay, well, how is headless or composable, architecture kind of actually solving this problem? I'd also say, like, in terms of headless, like, I think there needs to be a bit of an acknowledgement that most businesses are composable to an extent, right? Most of them will kind of, Klaviyo, whatever, kind of like having, parts or Algolia, and they already have got some sort of composable architecture there. It's just that most of it can be coupled to, Magento or a Shopify, something like that. So I think the biggest question you need to ask is, what are actually your business goals? The tech is literally meant to be, helping you kind of get there. And then, the agency you're working with should obviously give you a full idea in terms of like ongoing costs as well. Like, one thing that's sometimes overlooked is, you're paying one price for something like Shopify. You might have plugins and stuff like this, but when you're moving to, a headless or a composed kind of like environment where you have CMS costs, or digital experience kind of platforms, all these different kind of platforms, there will be potentially like a larger kind of monthly cost. Plus, you've got hosting, and all this kind of stuff. So I think getting a sense of monthly costs is really important as well. And finally, I'd be really reticent to say, do a big kind of sweeping change. The idea of like a composable architecture is that it's things that you can kind of break up, and you break those things up when you have that business need. I said, when you need more advanced search, that's when you bring in something out like Algolia. When you need, better digital asset management, you might go to like Cloudinary or something. You make those decisions at the right time. Headless is just part of that. You're kind of going, okay, when is the right time that we need to break out of what's happening here to create an experience that is not possible, or, that kind of like pushes us forward. So I would say really question it. Definitely don't go with the hype, and look at like kind of the business solutions that you're trying to solve, rather than looking at headless as a destination, and never have a big bang. Break it up into like kind of chunks.
I think that's very smart advice, and I guess sometimes, unfortunately, businesses need a big bang because they've got the dependencies of lots of old systems, and unpicking those to put one new one in, it gets quite challenging. Sometimes ripping everything out and replacing it can be the most cost effective, even if though it's painful were the big initial like earthquake to the business. But yeah, I think in general you always look at minimizing the complexity when you're changing over. So that makes sense. Jim, thanks for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed that.
It's great to speak to you both. Yeah, no, thank you so much for inviting me on.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. And if anyone wants to reach out, they want to find out a bit more, or they want to grill you on a particular element, or challenge you or anything, or ask questions about how you could help, like how do they get in touch?
Yeah, well, obviously just go to studiorotate.com and you can send any inquiries there. But also, if you just want to hunt me down and send me hate mail on LinkedIn, that's also welcome. I'm just
Stalk you.
JP Tattersall, so on LinkedIn. So yeah, obviously, like always keen to speak to people who want to talk about this stuff, and love the debate. Yeah,
I think it's good because what's nice is hearing somebody be honest and talk about, like, headless isn't the goal, and I think there's too much noise in the industry where people try and push headless as this panacea, and there are times, as you said, when it's just not the right solution. It adds unnecessary complexity, but actually there are times when it will unpick business inefficiency and give people the tooling to help them grow in a more effective way. And you need to decide on which side of the fence you're at, and at what point you tip towards needing a more flexible stack. So I appreciate the objective viewpoint today. And thanks everyone for listening as well. We hope you found that interesting. I know that was quite a technical one. Do reach out to Jim if you've got any questions, or give me and Paul a shout as well. Feel free to challenge us if you agree, disagree with anything you've heard today. And keep an ear out for next episode. We drop one every Tuesday. Do subscribe if you haven't already, and we'd love a rating on Apple, YouTube, or Spotify. Until next week, everybody. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.